reunion. Lauren said Kyle had tried to show up at Archie's apartment, and Archie wouldn't even open the door, just yelled through it that Kyle should leave. Tabitha had blocked Kyle's number entirely, and told mutual friends not to pass along any messages from him. Lauren sounded almost sad telling me this, like she felt bad for Kyle even though he was on my side. She said their parents were trying to stay neutral, but it was hard when two of their kids wanted nothing to do with their oldest brother. I told Lauren I was sorry the family was divided, but I wasn't sorry Kyle was facing social consequences. He'd spent months lying to everyone, and people were allowed to decide they didn't want liars in their lives. Actions had to mean something, or what was the point of anything? 5 months after the reunion, I got a call from the police department saying my grandmother's necklace was released from evidence. The case was closed with Kyle's guilty plea, and I could pick up the necklace anytime during business hours. I drove to the station the next day, my hands shaking a little on the steering wheel. A clerk brought out a plastic evidence bag with the necklace inside, had me sign some forms, and handed it over. I carried it to my car before opening the bag, and when I finally held the necklace in my hands, the weight of it hit me hard. 3 generations of women had worn this necklace on their wedding days. My grandmother had clasped it around my mother's neck, and my mother had clasped it around mine. It had survived wars and moves and decades of life, and then Kyle had stolen it to give to a 23-year-old intern. I sat in my car in the police station parking lot and cried for 20 minutes. Not sad tears exactly, just this overwhelming release of everything I'd been holding in the necklace was back. I'd fought for it and won, but it would never feel the same as it did before. I took the necklace to a jeweler the following week to have it cleaned and checked for any damage. The jeweler was an older man with careful hands who examined each ruby under his magnifying glass. He commented on the beautiful workmanship, asking about the history of the piece. I found myself telling him the whole story right there in his shop. How my grandmother wore it at her wedding in 1952. How my mother wore it in 1978. How I wore it in 2015. How my husband stole it and gave it to his mistress. How she wore it to a family reunion. How I exposed them both in front of 60 people. The jeweler listened with his eyebrows getting higher and higher, making appropriate sounds of shock and outrage. When I finished, he said any man who would steal a family heirloom like that wasn't worth the air he breathed. He cleaned the necklace carefully, checking every link and clasp, and refused to charge me for the service. He said it was the least he could do after what I'd been through, and I almost started crying again in his shop. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, Diane called to invite me to dinner with the family. She made it very clear that Kyle was not invited.
Cheesecake.
She said I was still family regardless of the divorce, and she wanted me at their table like always. Her voice
You
was
like
warm and
cheesecake
careful, like she was
because
afraid
we
I'd say no.
like
I told her I was
chocolate
really touched by the invitation,
cake.
and I appreciated her making it clear about Kyle, but I needed some space from family gatherings while I healed. Being around everyone would just remind me of the reunion and everything that happened after, and I wasn't ready for that yet. Diane said she understood completely, and the invitation stood for any future holiday when I felt ready. She told me she loved me, and she was proud of how strong I'd been through everything. We talked for a few more minutes about nothing important, and when we hung up, I felt grateful that I hadn't lost her, even though I'd lost her son. The divorce was finalized 6 months after the reunion, on a cold Tuesday morning in February. We met in a conference room at the courthouse with our attorneys and a judge who barely looked at us. The whole thing took maybe 20 minutes. The judge confirmed we'd both signed the settlement agreement, asked if we understood the terms, and declared our marriage dissolved. Kyle sat across the table from me, looking tired and angry, his jaw tight and his eyes fixed on the papers in front of him. He never looked at me once during the entire proceeding. When it was time to sign the final papers, my hand was steady. I watched Kyle sign his name in quick, harsh strokes, and then I said in the careful cursive my grandmother had taught me. The judge stamped the papers and said,
Ma,
Daddy.
you know,
Where's Daddy? Oh, I see the bird.
like I'd finally
Look
closed
at
it
the
2
bird.
months ago. I kept the necklace in my jewelry box for about a week after the divorce was finalized, but every time I looked at it, I felt sick. The rubies that used to remind me of my grandmother's love now reminded me of Kyle's betrayal, of Brianna wearing it at the reunion, of everything that had been stolen from me. I couldn't wear it and I couldn't display it, but I also couldn't sell it or give it away. It was still my grandmother's necklace, still 3 generations of family history, still worth $40,000. I decided to put it in a safety deposit box at my bank, somewhere secure where I wouldn't have to see it every day. The bank officer helped me set up the box and I placed the necklace inside, closing the small metal door with a sense of finality. Maybe someday I'd be ready to take it out again, to wear it or pass it on to someone I loved. But right now it carried too much weight, too much pain mixed in with the love. It was safer locked away where Kyle's betrayal couldn't touch it anymore, where I could decide what it meant to me on my own terms and in my own time. Lauren started texting me a few days after the divorce was final, just checking in at first, then sending funny memes and asking if I wanted to grab coffee. We met at a small cafe near my house the following Tuesday. she hugged me before we even sat down. She ordered us both lattes, and we talked for 2 hours about everything except Kyle at first. Just normal stuff about her kids and my work and a TV show we both watched. Then she got quiet and said she was glad I was still in her life, that she'd been worried I'd disappear after everything. I told her she wasn't responsible for her brother's choices, and I valued her friendship separate from him. She teared up a little and squeezed my hand across the table. After that, we met every week. Same cafe, same Tuesday morning time slot. We texted almost daily, sending each other photos of our coffee cups or complaining about traffic or sharing random thoughts. It felt genuine in a way my marriage never had, like I could be myself without performing. A month after the divorce, I finally called the therapist number my insurance company gave me. The receptionist scheduled me for the following week, and I almost canceled 3 times before the appointment. The therapist was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a calm voice, and she didn't push me to talk about anything I wasn't ready for. Our first session, I mostly cried and apologized for crying, and she handed me tissues and said crying was allowed. Over the next few months, we worked through everything. The betrayal and the
Oh no.
my broken ability to trust him.
Forever?
She helped me understand that Kyle's actions reflected his character. Not my worth as a person, I knew that intellectually from the start, but she helped me believe it deeper, in the parts of myself that still wondered what I'd done wrong. 8 months after the reunion, I ran into Jake at the grocery store while I was buying vegetables in the produce section. He looked uncomfortable at first, like he wanted to pretend he hadn't seen me, but I waved and he came over. We chatted for a few minutes about nothing important, and then he mentioned that Kyle was working at a much smaller company now for way less money. He said Kyle was living in a studio apartment across town and seemed pretty miserable. I didn't feel happy hearing that exactly, but I also didn't feel guilty. Kyle brought all of it on himself with his choices. Jake apologized again for not speaking up sooner, and I told him I understood family loyalty made things complicated. Around the same time, I started reaching out to friends I'd lost touch with during my marriage. I called my college roommate who I hadn't talked to in 3 years. I texted my former coworker who used to invite me to happy hours I always declined. I showed up at book club for the first time in forever. They all welcomed me back without making me feel bad about disappearing, and several of them admitted they never liked Kyle, but didn't know how to say anything. One friend said she'd tried to tell me once that Kyle seemed controlling, but I'd gotten defensive and changed the subject. Hearing that made me realize how slowly and carefully Kyle had isolated me from everyone who might have noticed what he was doing. Caroline called me on a random Thursday evening, clearly excited to share gossip. She said Kyle had been trying to date, but women kept finding out about what happened and losing interest. Apparently, the story of the reunion had spread through social circles and people talked. One woman had Googled him before their second date and found someone's blog post about the whole thing. Caroline was practically gleeful telling me this, and while I didn't take pleasure in Kyle's struggles exactly, I also thought reputation mattered, and he was learning that actions had consequences in a connected community. 3 weeks later, my boss called me into her office, and I had a moment of panic thinking something was wrong. Instead, she offered me the promotion I'd been hoping for before everything fell apart with Kyle. She said I'd seemed more focused and confident in recent months, and my work had really improved. I thanked her and tried not to cry. And later in my car, I realized that being free of Kyle's constant manipulation had actually made me better at my job. I had energy for work again, instead of spending it all managing his moods and lies. For Christmas, I decided to host a small dinner at my house, instead of spending the holiday alone. I invited Lauren, Archie, and Tabitha, plus 3 of my friends who didn't have family nearby. We cooked too much food and ate until we were uncomfortable, then played board games and laughed about stupid things. Tabitha told embarrassing stories about her college professors. Archie did impressions of their dad that made Lauren snort wine out of her nose. My friend told a story about her disastrous Tinder date that had us all crying with laughter. Sitting at my table, surrounded by people who chose to be there, I realized this felt more real than any holiday dinner during my marriage. Kyle and I had always performed for each other, playing roles of the happy couple, and this was just people being themselves. 2 days after Christmas, I got a card in the mail from Diane. Inside, she'd written a note acknowledging that the day would have been my 9th wedding anniversary, and saying she loved me and supported me no matter what. The gesture made me cry, but they were good tears this time. Grateful tears for a relationship that survived, despite everything her son had done. I called her that evening, and we talked for an hour about nothing important, just normal mother and daughter conversation, and I felt thankful I hadn't lost her. On my grandmother's birthday in February, I went to the bank and took the necklace out of the safety deposit box. I brought it home and spread old photo albums across my kitchen table, finding pictures of her wearing it at her wedding, at my mother's wedding, at my wedding. I looked at the necklace in my hands, and then at her face in the photos, young and then middle-aged and then elderly. I told her out loud that I was sorry the necklace got caught up in such ugly circumstances, but I'd protected it in the end, just like she'd protected me when she was alive. I put it back in the box the next day, still not ready to wear it or display it, but feeling more at peace with what it represented. A year after the reunion, Lauren came over for our regular Tuesday coffee, but we stayed at my house instead of going out. She seemed nervous about something, and finally told me that Kyle had been asking family members if they thought I'd ever speak to him again. I actually laughed out loud at that. The idea so ridiculous I couldn't help it. I told her absolutely not, that Kyle had countless chances to be honest with me, and he chose deception every single time. Some bridges deserved to stay burned, and that one was Ash. Lauren looked relieved and said she'd told him the same thing, and we moved on to talking about her daughter's upcoming birthday party. A few months after my conversation with Lauren about Kyle asking if I'd talk to him, I downloaded a dating app just to see what was out there. I wasn't looking for anything serious, just wanted to remember what it felt like to have someone show actual interest in me without lying about where they were going or who they were with. I went on a handful of coffee dates and one dinner that lasted 3 hours because the guy was funny and asked real questions about my life. On our second date, he asked about my divorce in that careful way people do when they're not sure if it's too personal. I gave him the short version about the affair and the stolen necklace, leaving out the dramatic family reunion part, and he shook his head and said any man who would steal from his wife is an idiot. The comment made me smile, not because I needed validation, but because it was nice to hear someone state the obvious without making excuses for Kyle's behavior. We went out a few more times, but it fizzled naturally, and I was okay with that because I wasn't ready for anything heavy anyway. I went on dates with 2 other guys over the next couple months, nothing that turned into a relationship, just practice at being myself around new people without the weight of Kyle's manipulation hanging over every interaction. In May, I got a text from Tabitha inviting me to her college graduation ceremony. She said the whole family would be there, and she really wanted me to come because I was still her sister, even though her brother screwed everything up. I bought a plane ticket that same day, and showed up at the university stadium wearing a blue dress and carrying flowers. The ceremony lasted 2 hours in uncomfortable folding chairs, but when Tabitha walked across that stage in her cap and gown, I stood up and cheered so loudly that Lauren turned around from 3 rows ahead and grinned at me. Afterward, we found Tabitha in the crowd of graduates taking photos, and she ran over and hugged me tight, thanking me for still being part of her life. I told her I loved her, and I was proud of her, and I meant every word, because she'd chosen integrity over easy family loyalty, just like Lauren had. We all went to dinner at a nice restaurant, me and Lauren and Archie and Tabitha and their parents, and nobody mentioned Kyle even though his absence was obvious. Diane squeezed my hand under the table at one point, and I squeezed back, and it felt like we were all moving forward together despite the damage her son had caused. On the flight home, I thought about the necklace sitting in its safety deposit box at the bank. I'd been avoiding really dealing with my feelings about it. Just keeping it locked away like that solved the problem. But sitting on that plane at 30,000 feet, I admitted to myself that the necklace would probably never feel the same way it did before Kyle stole it. The physical object was recovered and protected, but the emotional meaning had gotten complicated and messy. My grandmother wore it at her wedding full of hope and love. My mother wore it at hers with the same feelings. I wore it at mine thinking I was starting a life with someone honest and good, and that turned out to be a lie. The necklace witnessed 3 generations of love, but it also witnessed betrayal now, and I couldn't separate those things completely, no matter how much I wanted to. I decided that was okay though, because life is complicated, and things don't always get to stay pure and simple. The necklace's story included Kyle's chapter now, and I had to make peace with that instead of pretending it didn't happen. At my next therapy session, I brought up the necklace and my complicated feelings about its meaning. My therapist asked what I thought I might do with it eventually, whether I'd want to wear it again or pass it to someone else. I said I'd been thinking about maybe giving it to a future daughter or niece someday, creating new positive connections to balance out the negative ones Kyle added. The idea appealed to me because it meant the necklace's story would continue beyond Kyle's betrayal, proving that one person's actions don't get to define a family treasure forever. My therapist said that sounded like a healthy way to reclaim the necklace's meaning without pretending the theft never happened. We talked about how healing doesn't mean erasing the past. It means integrating difficult experiences into your life story without letting them control your future. I left that session feeling lighter, like I'd given myself permission to let the necklace be complicated instead of trying to force it back to what it was before. 3 weeks later, Lauren called with news she'd heard through family channels. Kyle's probation had ended, and he was apparently trying to rebuild his life in a different city about 4 hours away. He'd found a job at some small company and was renting a cheap apartment and basically starting over where nobody knew his history. Lauren asked if I wanted details, but I realized I didn't care about the specifics. I felt nothing when she told me this information. No anger or satisfaction or curiosity. Just complete indifference, like she was telling me about a stranger's life. I told Lauren that was probably the truest sign I'd moved on, when news about Kyle generated 0